we should do it consistently for time. Want to start today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 21st Annual Ecological Integration Symposium. This year, our theme is Ecology in the Anthropocene, and we have a bunch of really great speakers for you. And our first speaker is Dr. James Beasley. And Dr. James Beasley is an associate professor of wildlife ecology with a split appointment between the Savannah River Ecology Laboratory and the Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Georgia. Dr. Beasley received his bachelor's from SUNY Environmental Science and Forestry and his master's and doctoral degrees in wildlife ecology from Purdue University. While he's most known for his research in Chernobyl and Fukushima, which he's going to talk to you today about, his research spans a variety of topics, including carnivore and scavenger ecology, as well as investigating bioaccumulation of toxic compounds in the tissues of various animals, including wild game, among other topics. Today, Dr. Beasley will present radioactive wildlife, impacts of the Chernobyl and Fukushima nuclear accidents on large mammals.
Thanks, Samantha. It's really a great pleasure to be here today. I just want to make sure, can you hear me, Samantha?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. So thank you again for that great introduction. It's truly a great pleasure to be here, even if it's only virtually. What I thought I'd do is talk primarily about my research programs in Chernobyl and Fukushima. And there's been quite a few studies we've done over the last several years. So rather than get into any of the weeds on any particular studies, what I thought I'd do is kind of walk you through the general themes of how this program evolved and where it's going today based on some of the discoveries that we've made. So when most people think of Chernobyl or Fukushima, this is the sort of image that comes to your mind. So an abandoned wasteland, it's rotting infrastructure, largely devoid of life. And if there are any animals, they're probably highly mutated, have very low survival rates, things of that nature. And a lot of that's come about primarily through some media. There's been a lot of popular video games and movies, and so there's just kind of generated this mystery surrounding Chernobyl. And so there's been a lot of uncertainty of what's going on with animals, but the prevailing paradigm has been this is a landscape that's largely devoid of any sort of viable life. And that's gained so much attention lately that in the past couple of years, in the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone, they've now set up these tours that have become, really popular, especially after the recent HBO series. And so now hundreds and hundreds of thousands of tourists are flocking to Chernobyl just to see what it's like there. And so, which has created, as an aside, has created a bit of a challenge for research because of all the people that are now in that area. And so Chernobyl happened quite a while ago. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with this accident, this is an accident that happened back in 1986 in the former USSR. And so this was a nuclear power plant that, because of some human error and faulty equipment, resulted in this massive steam explosion in the middle of the night back about 33 years ago. And this was a sort of catastrophic accident where the actual reactor core exploded and disseminated throughout the landscape. And this is, to this day, the worst accident in history, and hopefully the worst accident that we'll ever see. But what a lot of people may not realize is that the contamination from Chernobyl was not localized just to the reactor or even the immediate vicinity of the reactor. This map here shows the dissemination of radionuclides, particularly cesium-137, throughout the northern hemisphere. And in fact, the Western world learned about the Chernobyl accident because some radiological workers up in Scandinavia went to work and their dosimeters were alarming that they had been exposed to radiation levels that were unnormally high. And so even today, there's restrictions on reindeer and things like that in Scandinavia just because they continue to be contaminated from radiation from Chernobyl. And so given the severity of the accident and the overall implications for human and wildlife health, there was an exclusion zone created in the days and weeks after the accident. And this is today known as the Chernobyl exclusion zone or the 30-kilometer zone. And so basically, they created a 30-kilometer radius around the reactor and evacuated the people from that landscape. Several 100,000 people initially evacuated, somewhere between 1 and 200,000 people ultimately evacuated, never to be able to go back to their homes. And so the landscape, when you approach this exclusion zone, looks like you see here on the right, where there's this big barricade guarded, armed guards guarding this gate. And so people generally don't come and go from the exclusion zone, but there's nothing to prevent wildlife. And so wildlife have been allowed to persist and enter and leave this zone as they wish. And so when you go into the zone and drive around, there's a couple things that become acutely apparent. One of which is the terrible human tragedy that this was. All these people were displaced from their homes and moved to the surrounding landscape to start new lives. And so when you walk through the houses and abandoned schools and things like that, you just see these reminders of this human toll and humans that once lived there. You see pictures that have fallen off the wall, or maybe some still hanging. You see children's toys laying on the ground, out in the yards. And so it's an eerie and sad reminder of the human impacts of this accident. But you also see evidence that nature is starting to reclaim things. Here's a photograph that I took from a water tower that shows an abandoned village where the forests are starting to encroach around the houses. And this is a common sight that you see throughout this landscape. And I also want to highlight the background here, where it's kind of this patchwork of old field and forest throughout a lot of the landscape. So here's a quick video. Hopefully it'll play. This is just a couple second clip of just driving down the roads. You know, it's kind of a bumpy clip because the roads are somewhat crumbling, the infrastructure is crumbling, but just this gives you a good idea of what the landscape's like in this area. So you can see there's a lot of, this is a very rural area, the majority of the landscape. And so you start to see some houses sporadic throughout the landscape. And so there's some things that we know, and there's some things we really don't know about what the impacts were from that accident. And so I want to start off kind of where I began, with some of the things that we do know that happened after that accident. And one of the things that was quite apparent right after the accident is that there were some severe initial effects on biota, both plants and animals. And probably the most pronounced example that some of you may have heard of is called the red forest. And that's what you see in the foreground of this photograph here. All those trees that look brown are pine trees that died from acute radiation exposure after the accident. And if you kind of squint in the background, you can see the reactor there a few miles in the distance. And so pine trees are particularly sensitive to radiation. And so this was an area of the landscape, I think it's maybe about 1% of the exclusion zone now, where there was such high levels of radiation that it killed the pine trees. There also were some immediate effects to plants, other plants and animals, livestock in the area as well, that received some very high acute radiation exposures. But a lot of the radionuclides on the landscape have decayed, so they have half-life. Some of them have very short half-lives. Others have very long half-lives that still persist today. But because of these elements that have short half-lives, radiation doses are now about 100 times lower than they were right after the accident, which isn't to suggest that the landscape isn't contaminated. It's still one of the most contaminated places on Earth. And even though there was radiation protection for humans where they were evacuated, there's never been any protection for wildlife. And so wildlife are continuously exposed to this chronic radiation exposure. And I'll use that word chronic a number of times. We know what acute radiation exposure does. We can do that in the lab. There's been a lot of experiments that have looked at effects of this acute blast of radiation exposure. Where there's much more as uncertainty is in the ecological or biological effects of chronic exposure at these lower doses. But from what you can see from this figure here, the only reason I put this up is to emphasize that these animals are still accumulating very high amounts of radionuclides in their tissues. So these numbers might be irrelevant for those of you without a radiation background, but the European Economic Commission set a level for safe human consumption for food at 600 becquerels per kilogram. You can see some of these animals have an average of 50 to 100,000 becquerels per kilogram, so orders of magnitude higher than what we would consider safe to consume them. And so this has really set up this interesting question of whether or not Chernobyl and now Fukushima are serving as an ecological sink or potentially a nature reserve. There are some papers in the literature that suggest that contamination levels are too high and Chernobyl is serving as the world's largest ecological sink. And then there's some other information in the literature that suggests just the opposite, that animals are doing quite well. And so this, as I began my research program there, this was these two competing paradigms were something that was a little bit to wrestle with in my head, of how there could be such differing disparities of findings. And what really was the catalyst for me to get involved in this research was the fact that there's been a couple of species of real conservation concern actually introduced into Chernobyl. And so we've got the Przewalski's horse here on the left that I'll talk about in a minute. One of the world's most endangered and rare large mammals was actually introduced in Chernobyl after the accident. We also have the European bison, another species of conservation concern. They too were introduced into Chernobyl in the 90s, the early 90s, after the accident. And so you have these two different ideas of this being a highly contaminated landscape, that we should be removing animals from there because of the contamination, and then another paradigm where people are actively introducing threatened and endangered species. And so really at that point, that's when I started to begin getting involved to try and understand what we know about impacts of radiation and status of large mammal populations in these areas. And it turns out there's really been very little work until the last couple of years on large mammals in Chernobyl and Fukushima as well. And some of that stems from the fact that these are just very difficult places to do any kind of studies, let alone large mammal studies. And so the research program that I had become involved in really set up to determine some of the responses of wildlife, both in terms of a population level, also at the individual level. And really where we're going here is to try and understand what the health effects are, and the health effects from a population, community level, all the way down to the molecular level. And so I'm going to start off talking a little bit about the work in Chernobyl, because that's where I started. And in the last part of the talk, the last several slides, I'll hit on some of the more recent work in Fukushima. But in Chernobyl, the accident was in the former USSR, and the exclusion zone now spans the countries of Belarus and Ukraine. And the northern half of the exclusion zone is the Belarus half. And that's what you can see here on the right-hand figure. And that's where the majority of the work that we're involved in has been conducted. And one thing I want to highlight on this figure is the fact that the radiation levels on the ground are highly heterogeneous. You can see that with the red and purple colors here showing being the more contaminated areas. And right down in this area here, that's where the reactor is. And so the reactor is right on the border of Ukraine and Belarus. And so Belarus is about 50% of the exclusion zone. But as you can imagine, Chernobyl is not the sort of place where you can just go and start doing work. There are so many logistical challenges to working in a landscape like this that you can imagine. And I won't dwell on that, but just getting permits and access to these areas, to get access to anesthetics, if you even can get access to anesthetics. These are all just simple issues that we have to deal with here in the United States, but in a place like this that's so contaminated, it just raises the level of logistical challenges tremendously. And so this is one of the reasons why it's been very difficult for many people to do large mammal work over here. And so one of the things we first wanted to figure out is what happened to wildlife right after the accident. We knew that there were effects to animals in those first days and weeks after the accident. But where our knowledge gap stopped is what happened in the several years after that accident. And so where we started this work was I began collaborating with some folks from France and the UK and some Belarusian colleagues to explore some data sets that they had the foresight to collect way back in the mid-1980s. So right after the accident, they actually had gone up in helicopters when radiation levels were so high and flew over the evacuation zone in these 3 different areas that represent different contamination levels on the landscape. And they did this during the winter and counted the numbers of various large mammals that they saw on the landscape. And this is a pretty standard wildlife technique that's used throughout the world. But these data were just being archived at the moment. And so we were able to work with this group and really explore these data. And our expectation at the outset was that populations of these animals would probably be very low, and we probably wouldn't see a major increase in the first few years after the accident. But as we began exploring the data, that's not exactly at all what we saw. You can see across the 3 species that they had data for: moose, roe deer, which is a species that's similar to a white-tailed deer here in the US, and wild boar. All 3 of these species increased pretty dramatically in the first decade after the accident. And you can see this is especially true for wild boar. Wild boar have a very fast reproductive rate, and you can see those populations just skyrocketed in the first few years after the accident. In 1993, 94, you see a big drop there. That has nothing to do with the radiation. There was actually a disease outbreak in that year, and also a growing wolf population, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So quite to our surprise, populations actually increased for a number of species. And so the next logical question we were interested in is, where were these animals increasing? Is this something that animals were just moving in from the surrounding landscape to repopulate this area now that humans weren't there? Or was the entire landscape, including the more contaminated areas, supporting large populations? And so for this, again, we turn to some data that were collected where these are all transects, all those green lines that you can see. There's several hundred kilometers of transects. And each one of these transects was walked every year for several years to count the number of tracks in the fresh snow. So after a fresh snow, people would go out and walk these transects and count tracks of everything from squirrels and hares all the way up to large mammals like moose and wolves. And what we did was develop a bunch of models to look at how landscape attributes and radiological attributes influence where we find these animals on the landscape. And across the board, for all the species, I'm only showing 4 here, we see no effect of radiological contamination on the relative abundance of these animals. They're not distributing themselves on the landscape relative to radiation levels. In fact, the most supported models in all these cases are habitat models. So we're finding the animals where their habitat is most suitable, which from an ecological perspective is what you might expect. So we know that animals increased in the first decade after the accident, and we know that animals became widely distributed throughout the landscape after that. And so the next logical question was, how do those populations compare to other nature reserves in the region? So maybe there are animals there, but maybe they're still highly suppressed compared to other places in Belarus. And so this is a fairly busy graph, but I want you to focus on the dark bar for each species. That dark bar is the relative population density or index of population for Chernobyl, and all the other bars, the different shades of gray, are the different nature reserves in Belarus. And so these are those same track count data. In Belarus, it's a standard practice by their wildlife biologists to do these track count surveys every year after fresh snow in all their nature reserves. And really the take-home message from this figure is that a decade or 2 after the accident, populations of all these species are as high or higher in Chernobyl than the other nature reserves, with a notable exception of gray wolves. So as you can see on that far right figure, the wolf population in Chernobyl is much higher than the other nature reserves. And wolves eat all these other species that are listed here. And so, it's not too much of a logical leap to suggest that wolves could be suppressing some of these populations. And had the numbers of wolves been lower, some of those populations may be even higher. And so really all of these findings, these initial findings from our early studies were quite opposite of what we might have initially expected based on some of the published literature and some of the anecdotal information. And so over the next couple of years, we designed a whole suite of other studies to try and validate or refute these findings using some other methods and some other more modern techniques. And one of the things that we've done is to design a whole series of different remote camera studies. Remote cameras have become a pretty remarkable tool in wildlife research nowadays. And so we did studies with sense stations, which is this figure on the left. We distributed sense stations throughout all the drivable roads in the Belarus side of the exclusion zone to survey for carnivore populations. We did scavenging studies, as you can see on the right-hand figure here, to look at the diversity and community composition of vertebrate scavengers. We've also put unbaited cameras out on roads to survey for ungulates and other species. And then finally, we've also begun putting cameras out in abandoned buildings and barns, because as you're walking around this landscape and walk into these barns and buildings, you routinely see evidence that the animals are utilizing them. There might be scat on the ground or tracks. We found wild boar farrowing nests inside abandoned houses where people in former bedrooms and things of that nature. So animals are using these buildings. And so we began exploring how animals are utilizing them and what species are actually utilizing them. So I'm not going to go through all the details of these different studies, but I just want to show another quick video here to highlight a couple of the different species. This is the roe deer, that species I mentioned, like a white-tailed deer. You can see their antler structures a little bit different. So here's a Canada Eurasian lynx, a moose. Here's a red deer, some fox, and then a wolf pack carrying some prey. There's one of those European bison. That's a raccoon dog. And then, of course, a pack of wolves. And so we've captured several 100,000 images of wildlife to this point and begun analyzing the data in a variety of different ways. And one of the things we've begun doing is to run a variety of different landscape models, incorporating those radiological attributes and habitat attributes like we did for the track count data. And across the board, across all the species that we've been able to model thus far, we see no effect of radiation on their distribution from these camera data sets. In fact, again, it's habitat that's driving them. We find them where the habitat that they generally prefer is most suitable. And so, for example, this figure on the left here is some data from a raccoon dog distribution. All those blue stars represent detections of those animals. And what it turns out is that we find these animals closer to wetland areas, riparian areas, which is one of the primary habitats that this species targets. So regardless of whether those habitats occur in the most contaminated areas or the least contaminated areas, we tend to find them where the habitat's suitable. And as I mentioned, we've also been putting some of these cameras in buildings as well. And this has proved to be a pretty interesting avenue. And so here's a quick video again showing some of these animals utilizing these buildings. These are some examples of the endangered Przewalski's horse. Whoops. And so these horses are actually going into these barns routinely. We see them sleeping in there, particularly in the springtime when biting fly levels are really high. We see lynx like this going in, probably hunting rodents. This was pretty surprising. These are moose. This is a red deer inside those buildings. We've seen big bull moose like this walking through barns. We have wolves, wild boar. Pretty much the vast majority of mammals that we've detected out in the forest we're actually seeing in these buildings as well as lots of other species like birds. We routinely see owls, things of that nature roosting inside these buildings. So animals have really taken advantage of these vacant habitats, and the impacts and implications to those animals are unclear, but I suspect that they're likely providing some thermal refuge during the winter and some increased roosting or denning habitats for some species as well. But one of the things we've noticed is these Przewalski's horses. So we're seeing extensive use of these barns by these horses. And so I just wanted to mention this because this is a pretty remarkable species. They were actually extirpated from the wild in the 1970s. They're only found in zoos and captive facilities. And then a few years later, they began reintroducing populations around the world. And so I believe there's 6 introduced populations at the moment, most in Mongolia and China and areas like that. But they actually introduced a population in the late 1990s. So this is only 12 years after the accident, when radiation levels were much higher than they are today. And they introduced these 21 individuals, and there's really not been a lot of active management like you might suspect. These animals were released. There's not been a tremendous amount of research to follow up to understand their demography, genetic diversity. You can imagine these animals have gone through a number of severe genetic bottlenecks, but we really don't have much information at this point. And so this is a species that right now, in the next year or two, we're prepping some studies to try and explore some of these questions. But anecdotally, we know that these populations have increased from these initial 21 to a high somewhere a little under 100 to my knowledge. So this population has increased, but whether or not it's healthy, what the health implications are, is something that we really don't know at the moment. But of all the species that we've been observing on our cameras and through our various trapping programs, there's a couple that have really stood out to me as being particularly exciting. And this is one of them. This is a Eurasian lynx. This is actually an animal we caught in a trap there that you can see just beside it. And so this is a species that really was not found in Chernobyl at the time of the accident, or if it was extremely uncommon. Lynx now are widely distributed throughout the zone, and they routinely show up on cameras. So this is a species that is now fairly abundant and has naturally colonized the zone. So an example of some natural rewilding, not just the introduced species that I just mentioned. This is another one that's really exciting. This is something we're still trying to verify, but we believe this to be a European wildcat. If that's the case, this would be the first sighting of this species in Belarus in nearly a century. They occur in some other surrounding countries, but they've been extirpated from Belarus for many, many decades. And so we're trying to get verification that that's in fact what this species is. It doesn't suggest that it's established a population there, but it does have some exciting implications that there's the potential for that to occur in the future. And this is probably the most exciting photo that we've been able to capture, or sequence of photos. This is actually a brown bear. Brown bear were not found in Chernobyl at the time of the accident. And in the last 10, maybe 15 years, there's been some evidence that some brown bears have appeared in the Ukraine side of the exclusion zone. And this is some evidence showing that they're also utilizing the Belarus side of the exclusion zone. And so there's now an estimated several brown bears in the Chernobyl exclusion zone between Belarus and Ukraine. And so another example of a really large apex predator carnivore naturally repopulating this landscape now that humans are evacuated. But the species that's really drawn the most attention with our research and the most excitement has been gray wolves. As I mentioned earlier on, gray wolves are now highly abundant throughout the exclusion zone. But there's a couple of really interesting things when you begin exploring some of the patterns of where these animals occur. So as you're driving around the exclusion zone, it becomes very apparent as you're looking for evidence of wildlife that the wolf population is not ubiquitous, or at least their activity is not ubiquitous. You tend to see more tracks, more scat, things of that nature towards the interior, more contaminated parts of the zone. And so we initiated a whole variety of different studies to better understand the implications of this to wolves and better understand how wolves are utilizing the landscape. And one of the first things we did was to do a scat survey and genetic mark recapture study, which is still ongoing. So these are just preliminary data, but this is basically, you can view it as a sort of a heat map, where those red colors represent higher densities of scat on the landscape. And you can see very clearly that the density of scat is much more concentrated in the interior part of the evacuation zone. And again, if you can think back to that radiological layer I showed earlier, that's where the more contamination exists on the landscape. And so this really led us to try and start to tackle this question a little bit more about why these wolves are concentrating in this area. And so we began in 2014 doing a whole series of different studies on wolves, where we began capturing wolves, putting GPS collars on wolves, taking biological samples, taking radiological measurements on these animals. And one of the things we also started doing with these wolves is attaching a novel type of GPS transmitter. And so we actually, in collaboration with a couple different companies and some other collaborators of mine, we developed a new type of GPS transmitter that not only records GPS spatial locations, but also collects radiation dose rates that animal is experiencing in near real time. And what's unique about it is that it also syncs those dose estimates with location estimates. So we can get a good spatial map of where those spatial and temporal variability in dose rates occur. And the reason this is important is because most radiological studies that are done on wildlife are conducted where you catch that animal or make some really general assumptions. So for example, for this wolf here, we might take a radiation measurement where we caught this animal. But we know that wolves have home ranges that are tens or hundreds of square kilometers. And so when you have high degrees of heterogeneity in contaminant levels, that one single dose may or may not reflect the exposure of that animal. And there's a lot of uncertainty in a lot of health effects studies. And this is one of the reasons, because it's really difficult to get accurate radiological data. And so we try to use these collars as a way to better inform some of those models. And so I'm not going to go into all the details of the different spatial analyses, but I did want to put this figure up because I think the implications are pretty striking. So the bottom red dotted line is the Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone, and the reactor is just on the north end of that lake that you can see there. And so here's home range data for all the wolves that we've tracked to this point. And we haven't captured an individual from every pack yet, but we've captured individuals across a wide distribution of the exclusion zone. And what you can see very clearly here is that all territories of the packs that we've tracked to this point are constrained within the exclusion zone, between the Belarus and Ukrainian side of the exclusion zone. These animals aren't routinely coming and going from the exclusion zone, with the exception of one wolf that we had that was a young male that dispersed several hundred kilometers away. But what you can also see, especially on the northern end of this exclusion zone, all that fragmentation from agriculture. As soon as you leave the exclusion zone, there's these large crop fields. It often reminds me of Iowa or places in the Midwest like that, where you have these large, several hundred acre crop fields. And those they start right as soon as you cross the boundary. And in Belarus, there's also a bounty on wolves. And so there's heavy harvest pressure on those animals. And so a great incentive for them not to leave the exclusion zone. So we've started to explore this a little bit more with some of our movement data. And remember, there's an exclusion zone on the bottom as well. And so what we did was look at the distribution of their movements relative to the border. And as you can see from this top figure here, across all the individuals that we've analyzed thus far, there's a strong selection for areas further from the border. So again, supporting some of that scat data that I showed you and some of the anecdotal observations. In terms of habitat, we also see a selection of more open habitats where wolves tend to be avoiding some of the forest cover and being concentrated in some of the more open habitats. And this, I suspect, has to do with some of the prey that are found in those areas. There's a lot of large ungulates there that wolves are targeting. Sorry, my computer's, there we go. And so in terms of radiation exposure, this is where things get particularly interesting. So we would expect, given this distribution of radiation on the landscape, individual wolves to have highly disparate radiation exposure. But as I mentioned before, most models, most risk assessment models assume an average exposure across the landscape. And this is believed to be a conservative approach. And so this is how most risk assessments would be done. They would estimate an average exposure for an animal and use that for their models. And so that's really what we're trying to dig into here, is to see if that's actually a reliable estimate, or do we need to get some more refined data through methods like these collars. And so here's our two extremes of our data set. These are two different wolves, Eva on the left and Opie on the right, and they occupy areas with vastly different radiation contamination. And in fact, you can see that Eva has about 11 microsieverts per day, which is about 10 to 20 times above background, where either you or I are sitting today. So still fairly contaminated. But Opie, on the other hand, has radiation levels almost an order of magnitude higher than Eva. So even within this one landscape, we have vastly different radiation exposures among individuals. That I think we can expect given the distribution on the landscape. But what I think is a little more interesting is when you look at that individual heterogeneity in radiation exposure. So even within an individual, what do those variabilities in radiation look like? And so this is just less than 2 weeks of data for one particular wolf. And we just cut out one little example here because I think it highlights the point I'm trying to make fairly clearly, that you have individuals that are experiencing 0 to 1 microgray per hour routinely, but then within a matter of a day move to areas that are 30 to 35 micrograys per hour. So huge disparity in radiological contamination that these animals are exposed to. And I think what this highlights is the fact that capturing an animal and taking measurements where you capture that animal might be quite misleading in terms of what that animal's likely radiation exposure is. And the implications for this have to do with risk assessments. And so most risk assessment models would assume an average home range or something like that around that animal. And so when you actually use those standard methods and apply this empirical data to it, what we find is that of 5 of the 8 wolves, those models would underpredict radiation exposure. And so these models are supposed to be conservative, but yet we're showing that that's really not the case. And so ultimately that challenges whether or not that's the right way that we should be going about doing these risk assessments, or should we think about some other methods that might be better capturing some of this variability. And I think it also has some implications for health effects studies. And so when we think about health effects, we can't just think about that in really simplistic terms. Unfortunately, it's a much more complex problem that we have to deal with. And so really at this point in Chernobyl, that's where we're going with all of this. We're starting to work with some of these horses a little bit, and we're really continuing the streams that I just mentioned, but ultimately getting at some of the health effects. But now I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident. Since this was much more recent, this happened in 2011, and was also caused by something very different than the Chernobyl accident. Whereas the Chernobyl accident was an explosion due to some human error and some issues with equipment, the Fukushima accident happened from a massive earthquake and tsunami. Some of you may recall some of the news stories and watching this in real time unfold on the news, where this massive tsunami came ashore and basically overpowered the reactors, backup cooling systems. And you can see that tsunami on the upper left-hand side of the screen there. So this was, again, a massive human tragedy. There were thousands and thousands of people killed from the tsunami. But there also was a major radiological contamination event like in Chernobyl. The Fukushima accident was not as bad as Chernobyl, but was still a level 7, which is the worst kind of nuclear accident that we can have. And it resulted in a massive evacuation of over 100,000 people from the landscape. But there's one pretty big difference between these accidents that I did want to highlight. And that's the fact that in Chernobyl, a lot of the landscape after the accident was left in place, where nature was been allowed to recover, and a lot of the animals have been left. There's been research there. Whereas in Japan, there's been very extensive remediation efforts, like you can see on the bottom right here. There are large parts of the evacuation zone where they've gone in and stripped off the topsoil, put it in bags, and piled these bags. They have millions and millions of these bags of contaminated vegetation and soil that they're moved out and trying to repopulate the landscape. And so this has created a really unique experimental design from a radiological and an ecological standpoint that a lot of our work is trying to take advantage of. And so originally that green and red area that you can see there was the evacuation zone. But over time, those remediation efforts have been cleaning up these areas, and natural decay has resulted in lower radiation levels. And today that red area is about 371 square kilometers. That's what remains of the original exclusion zone. All of that green area has been reopened for repopulation. Now, a lot of the population has not come back. Only about 5 to 10% of the people have come back. But what it's done is created a unique gradient where you have areas where people have been excluded for many years now, nearly a decade. You have an area where people are starting to slowly come back, so it has an intermediate level of human activity. And then really close by, because of the distribution of radiation on the landscape, you have a control area where people were never evacuated, and radiation levels are very low or at background levels. And so we've really started to design a whole variety of experiments around this general idea of having this variable amount of human activity and radiological exposure in a pretty short distance. And within 20 kilometers or so, you can go from the exclusion zone into the control area. And so you can do some replicated experiments to account for that. And so we've started a whole variety of different camera studies. Like in Chernobyl, we've been doing some mesocarnivore studies on reptiles, a lot of different studies on wild boar and other species. And so a lot of this work, again, mirrors some of the stuff in Chernobyl, but it's a little bit more in its infancy. So I don't have the results of all these studies to this point, but one of the studies I did want to particularly highlight, this was the first study we began several years ago. And so what we did here is a very vast remote camera experiment to try and capture that variance that exists on the landscape because of these different zones. And one of the other unique things about this landscape is you have a coastal area with coastal ecosystems, but very quickly, as you can kind of see if you look at this figure, it moves right up into the mountains. So there's high elevation and low elevation areas juxtaposed right next to each other. And so what we're able to do is explore this with a couple different ecosystem types and also a variety of different species, because some species are more prevalent in some of these areas than others. And so what we did was create a remote camera network that was balanced across each of these zones and across both of these these elevational gradients to try and test some of those, again, similar questions of where we find these animals on the landscape, and really also try to tease out this idea of human habitation, whether or not there was any zone effect on where these animals occur on the landscape. And these camera surveys were done from 2015 to 2016. And so over we separated these into two-month periods. So over the 4-month of these studies, we ended up with over 250,000 images, almost 300,000 images of wildlife photos. So really capturing a really remarkable diversity of animals in this landscape. And here's just a couple of examples of some of the species that occur there. Japanese macaque on the top left. Below that's a Japanese siro, which is kind of like a forested mountain goat, and a whole variety of other species on the landscape. And so what we did was run those population models. And this is a really busy figure, and so I'm just going to focus your attention on a few of the different species. But in general, most of these species, we find elevation to be the strongest predictor of where they occur on the landscape, or elevation, and some habitat variables. But there are 6 species where zone or the zone and elevation interaction are the primary factors driving their distribution on the landscape. And these are wild boar, raccoon, green pheasant, macaques, which are those monkeys, Japanese marten, and the Japanese serow, with 5 of these species being most abundant in the evacuated areas and the serow being the exception. And I'll talk about these all individually in just a second. But the 3 that I really wanted to highlight that have the most pronounced impacts, or the 4, were the wild boar, raccoon, macaque, and serow. And the 3 that were most abundant in the evacuated areas are all species that are heavily controlled and nuisance animals. They raid crops, they cause property damage, similar issues that we have here in the US with particularly raccoons and wild boar. And so they're heavily controlled in a lot of areas. And so we might expect that these animals might particularly benefit from the lack of people, because they're all generalists, they're able to exploit these human habitats, and they're also able to be freed from human persecution as well, with serow being the exception that I'll talk about. The first is wild boar, though. So the majority of our images were of wild boar. Wild boar exhibited the most pronounced differences among the 3 different zones, where you see nearly 4 times higher populations in the exclusion zone compared to the inhabited zone. And in fact, wild boar were observed on, I think, 119 of our 120 cameras. But you can see from this figure here on the left that most of those animals are concentrated in the evacuated zones, with intermediate populations in the restricted zones. And wild boar in this area are a nuisance species. They're heavily trapped or harvested because of their impacts to crops. And one of the things that I find particularly remarkable about these high populations in the exclusion zone is the fact that after the accident, the population was recognized to be increasing rapidly. And so the federal government implemented a trapping program where they have professional trappers that go out there and remove boar, and remove large numbers of boar from both the excluded and restricted zones. So despite this intensive removal of animals from the landscape, we still see much larger populations than the inhabited areas. But one of the more interesting things that we've seen is somewhat of a shift in their activity. So when you drive around some areas of the exclusion zone, it's not uncommon to see wild boar on the road like this. Here's a couple of different sows with their piglets, but we routinely see boar walking through the streets of abandoned towns and abandoned cities for that matter. And so when you actually look at their activity data from these cameras, we see an actual shift in diurnal activity of wild boar, which is that red line that you can see there. So the blue and green line are the restricted and inhabited areas, but the exclusion zone in the middle of the day, we clearly see a shift that's significant in the models in terms of activity patterns. Similarly, Japanese macaques, this is again, we don't necessarily think of primates in this way here, but over there, macaques are often considered a nuisance species. They're generalists, they're able to exploit human areas, and they cause damage to crops and property as well. And so there's some control programs in place in various areas to control populations just to reduce these damages. And this is another species where we see a really pronounced increase in numbers in the exclusion and restricted areas compared to the inhabited zone. And one of the things I think that's going on here is these animals are easily able to exploit some of these former human occupied areas. It's not uncommon to drive through some evacuated areas and see scenes like this. These are some macaques that are sitting on the roof of an abandoned house. You often see them going into these houses or moving around in the yards or on the rooftops of houses. And so they seem to have been able to readily exploit these vacant habitats that now occur on the landscape. And unfortunately, what this has also ultimately done is create an increase in a real challenge in terms of human-wildlife conflicts. So this image on the left is a wild boar in a playground of a school, a local school. And this is routinely where you see these animals, is in these urban areas, right in backyards. A lot of the trapping occurs in these kind of more industrialized urban areas, like you see here. And on the right, that's some borer rooting damage. And so that's about a ½ meter deep. It's hard to tell with the scale there. And so these animals are coming in and really causing a lot of damage. And with the excluded area, it's maybe a little bit less of an issue, but in the areas where people are trying to repopulate, these animals are quite abundant and causing a real human-wildlife conflict issue that's become challenging for people trying to repopulate these areas. Now, the only exception that we've seen to this pattern is the Japanese siro. So this is a somewhat sacred animal in Japan, again, kind of like a mountain goat. And this is an animal that tends to avoid human activity. And so this was quite surprising that we're seeing higher populations of siro in these inhabited areas. And you can see just to the north here of this control area, that's where these populations are. And one thing I do want to emphasize is that, this control area is pretty rural up in the mountains. The coastal area is densely populated, but up in the mountains, it's rural mountainous habitat, steep mountains. There are plenty of people there in small towns, but there's also plenty of forests for these animals to escape. And so this is something we're really starting to explore now to figure out what exactly is going on. Why is this one species displaying this pattern? Are they particularly sensitive to radiation in some capacity, or is there something else going on? And of all the ways that we looked at this point, one of the things that really stands out is the impacts, potential impacts of wild boar. So siro are really sensitive to disturbance and competition from ungulates. So in this part of Japan, there are some species of deer, but at very, very low densities. They tend to occur much more inland than this. But populations of wild boar, as I mentioned, have exploded in evacuated and restricted zones. And when you actually do some regression modeling, we see that the density of wild boar, or the abundance of wild boar, is a very strong, significant negative predictor of siro abundance. So whether it's correlation or causation, we haven't quite figured that out yet, but it's quite possible that these animals are being competitively excluded in some capacity by wild boar. So that's something we're starting to explore a little bit more. And one of the ways that we're doing that is through looking at movement ecology. And so we've really started to increase our research on movement ecology, putting out these dosimeter collars on wild boar, on mesocarnivores, on snakes. On snakes, we've actually attached other sorts of dosimeters to try and get an idea of what their radiation levels are, ultimately to understand how these animals are utilizing the landscape in these abandoned areas. And for the sake of time, I'm not going to be able to go into all the details, but one of the things that's become quite apparent across all the species is that these animals are heavily exploiting human-dominated areas, or formerly human-dominated areas. On the left-hand side there, those are wild boar locations. You can see that this particular individual, and I just picked this as a random one, they all seem to do this, is moving from backyard to backyard to backyard. And so when people used to live there, this would not have been the case. There would have been heavy pressure for these individuals to not have been there. So this is probably one of the reasons why there's such high populations of boar. There's lots of vacant habitats and niche space that's opened up. And we see the same thing with the civets that we've tracked on the bottom right, often finding them in buildings. Snakes, most of our snakes we found in abandoned buildings. And so there seems to be an extensive use of these buildings by these wildlife that we're starting to explore in a bit more detail. But ultimately, where we're trying to go with a lot of this Fukushima work is, what are the ultimate health effects? It's clear that there are not population level effects to these animals. So what are the health effects, if there are health effects? And where we've started with that is looking at what are some of the exposure rates, the bioaccumulation of some radionuclides on the landscape. And this is the largest, kind of most comprehensive snake data set to date. And there's really been very little work done on snakes, despite the fact that they're a top predator in a lot of systems. And we see these snakes are accumulating very high levels of contamination. Japan has a consumption limit of 100 becquerels per kilogram of cesium. You could see some of these individuals are averaging around 10,000. So very contaminated. Same thing with wild boar. You can see wild boar 20, 25, even some up to 30,000 becquerels per kilogram versus that 100 mark. And so these animals are still highly exposed, highly contaminated. But what this figure really does is showcases the fact that there's a lot of variability among individuals. And that's really where these health effects questions become interesting. With this amount of variability, we can really start to dig into those questions of at what thresholds do we start to see effects. And none of these results are published with the exception of one. This is all work that we've just begun in the last couple of years. But one of the main ways that we know radiation impacts wildlife and humans is reproductive effects. So we're going out and looking at both male and female reproductive parameters to see whether or not there are any effects that we can detect, and ultimately whether or not that relates into any biologically meaningful impacts. For example, if we do see a reduction in sperm count in males by 10%, does that have any real biological consequence? And so that's kind of the line of research that we're going down there. Similarly, for diseases and parasites, are animals exposed to higher levels of radiation susceptible to more diseases and parasites because of the other issues that other challenges trying to deal with this radiological exposure? Through some collaborations with some folks at Colorado State, we're trying to get at some really fine scale molecular analyses to try and see at the chromosome level whether we see any aberrations or dicentrics in chromosomes caused by radiation, which is something that we know high levels of radiation can cause. And then also looking at other sorts of individual biological level effects. And this is a paper that actually just came out a couple of weeks ago, where we're looking at cataracts through some collaborations with some other folks at Colorado State, looking at cataract development and how radiation influences or does not influence cataract development. And really the main message from that paper is that even boar exposed to high levels of radionuclides did not have significantly higher effects of cataracts. So we know eyes are sensitive to radiation, but the levels that we're seeing in Fukushima boar are still not high enough to cause any sort of cataract or eye impairment. So this work is all ongoing. Ultimately will help inform some of the population level studies that we're doing. But just some concluding thoughts to wrap up here. The majority of the work that we've been doing at this point has been at the population and community level. And I think across the board, there's pretty widespread and conclusive evidence that we are not seeing evidence of suppressed wildlife populations, at least at the population scale in these areas. In fact, we're seeing natural recovery, natural rewilding of some populations of species in these areas to the levels that are similar or even exceed those of other nature reserves. And so ultimately what this suggests is that if there are any impacts, those impacts must be occurring at the individual or molecular scale and not scaling up to the population level. And so this is, I really want to emphasize, this isn't to suggest that radiation is a good thing and that these should be turned into national parks for animals. I think the point is there's still a lot that we don't know. And we do know that radiation causes some impacts. What there's fewer information on out there is at what threshold those effects occur. But ultimately, they're not scaling up to the population level. And I think ultimately what this is suggesting is that just our everyday lives as humans, clearing land, just being active on the landscape, has greater negative impacts to wildlife communities than some of these nuclear accidents, at least in years and decades after the accident. And so with that, I'd like to thank a lot of people. A lot of this work is in collaboration with folks at many other universities, especially Fukushima University. They've been tremendous partners through all this work. And with that, I'll leave it with this. I often like to close with this type of slide. This is a human memorial that was set up outside the evacuation zone. And all those names are some of the towns of people, some of the towns that were displaced from Chernobyl. So just to reemphasize that this is a terrible human tragedy, even though the impacts to wildlife seem to be less severe. And so with that, I thank you for your attention and participating today, and I'll take any questions you might have.
Anyone who has any questions, you're free to unmute your mic and ask the questions, or you can post in the chat and I can read the question for you. So someone asked, you actually went to the restricted zone at Chernobyl. Was that stressful?
Yeah, so I've been to the Fukushima zone, I think, a dozen times now, and Chernobyl several times as well. And actually, the first time that we started research there, we lived there for a whole month, and some of my research team stayed there for 2 or 3 months. And when I started this work, I mean, I'm a wildlife ecologist. I'm not a health physicist or a radiation specialist. I've kind of evolved over time to learn a lot about those fields. But so at first there was a lot of uncertainty in terms of what the impacts are, but really the radiation doses that you receive there are quite low, and if you're responsible. And so we wear dosimeters to track our radiation levels all the time. And actually, since I have one of those, I carry it with me on the airplane. And most times I'm exposed to more radiation on the airplane ride over and back than the whole time inside the exclusion zone. Because when you're on an airplane, you're much closer to the sun, and there's a lot of radiation that comes from the sun. So people who live in Denver, for example, have much higher daily radiation exposures. So we take a lot of precautions. You saw that I was in one of those photos wearing a full face respirator. That's because radiation's in the soil, and you really do not want to be breathing in that radioactive dust. So as long as you're use some common sense and take some practical precautions, you can work there quite safe.
Another question, what drew your interest to study radiation in Chernobyl and its effect on animals? I've always been fascinated with that disaster myself.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I get that one a lot because that wasn't my initial interest in this field. My main interests are large mammal ecology, and what really drew me into it was the fact that where I work right now, there's a lot of interest in effects of nuclear on ecosystems, and so I began talking with people and reading a lot of literature on Chernobyl. And one of the things that was most striking to me was that there was a wide disparity in the literature on what the effects were. There were almost no published studies on large mammals, and there were studies suggesting that this is one of the world's largest ecological sinks, and other studies suggesting that there's wildlife in abundance there. And so, as someone with an inquisitive mind, that's something I really was intrigued by, and so I really spent several years trying to develop collaborations with folks to begin to tackle some of those questions, to really figure out what's going on with animals in these areas. We're introducing one of the most endangered large mammals on Earth. Is that okay? Is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing? Those are all questions that really were unanswered from my perspective.
So I actually have a question as well. So this whole virtual symposia is due to COVID-19. So talking about human activity, with humans being home more often than out and about now, would you expect that wildlife, if this was for the long term, would start being active in areas that they typically aren't?
I don't think you would see it at the level that, well, there are some anecdotal stories already. I've not seen firsthand evidence of this, but I've heard uh, some news reports of, I believe, dolphins in Italy, if I'm not mistaken, in some of the areas where people didn't even realize that there were dolphins. And so I think there could be some subtle impacts, but I think it would take a period of time. And one of the reasons why I think if there was any response, it would be much more subtle, is because we're all still here. We're just moving around a bit less. So, so if, for example, if this were to carry on for several years, which we all hope that absolutely doesn't happen, but if it were, then there would be much less traffic on roads and things. So you could envision some animals learning to some degree. I don't know that you would see large responses in populations or animals all of a sudden infiltrating towns and cities, but there might be some more subtle effects.
Okay, and we also have another question. Thank you for that. And do you have any idea about the water contamination in both Chernobyl and Fukushima areas?
Yes, well, I have some limited knowledge of it. One of the things about those accidents is they're vastly different in some capacities that I didn't discuss, and one of those is the bioavailability of the contaminants. So cesium is the main contaminant that we're talking about. It is an analog to potassium, and it can bind with soil if the soil has high clay content and other minerals. And in Chernobyl, the landscape is mostly sand. And because of that, the cesium is still very bioavailable. So plants are still picking it up very easily. And so it can easily be moved throughout the food chain. In Fukushima, there's much more organic material in the soil. And so that cesium is fixed in the soil much more readily than in Chernobyl. And the reason I'm describing that is because a lot of the radiation in these areas, in the aquatic areas, comes, it was deposited there, but also runoff from streams and things of that nature. And so in Fukushima, a lot of that runoff is no longer, a lot of the cesium there is more fixed. So there's less effects likely there. But the fish in Fukushima, there's some studies out there that show accumulation of very high rates, to the point where there's restrictions on consuming fish throughout Fukushima prefecture. Chernobyl, there's very high levels of radiation in a lot of aquatic species as well. And there's been quite a bit of work done on aquatic invertebrates and fish to look to see whether or not that manifests in any sort of effects. But in general, especially in Chernobyl, the levels in the water are quite high.
We have another question. Are the studies evaluating individual survival in these impacted regions? I wonder if lifespan is shorter in regions impacted with radiation.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's one of the things that we're trying to do. One of the big challenges with that has been the ability to work in those areas over a long period of time consistently. Quite surprisingly, this is something that there's very, very little funding for. It's not something that there's much funding in the US for, and it's something that internationally is not well funded either. So putting together long-term studies is a little difficult. In terms of large mammals, we've not been able to do that thus far, simply because being able to track individual animals for several years has not been practical. But that's something we're really trying to get at over in Fukushima in some capacity. So that's a direction we're very interested in going. I think that's a very logical conclusion, that there could be some shortened lifespan. But I'll point out that a lot of these radiological effects are related to things like cancer. And cancer in many species is very long developing. And which is why that's one of the important reasons why, and I didn't mention this, that these findings are really not applicable to humans. You know, a lot of these animals in a pure natural setting with no external pressures only live a couple of years, maybe a decade at the very most. And so a lot of these things that take many years to develop and have an impact might not be manifesting. But that's a great question. I think that's something that we really need to be exploring.
We have another question regarding funding. So do you think that the lack of funding is due to situations like this being uncommon?
Yeah, I think it is. It's, I mean, for those of you who are in kind of involved in the funding cycles and things, I mean, just as humans, we tend to be very reactionary and not proactive, unfortunately. And a lot of that translates into funding. And we're seeing that right now with this current crisis that's going on. There's all of a sudden lots of funding for research on some of these things and supplies. Yeah, I think that's the case. I think that if there was a tragic accident somewhere that was more localized, there would probably be some resources available. And there actually was. The field of radioecology was quite well funded many years ago, back when there was a lot of nuclear weapons testing. And because, you know, regardless of where you sit in the world, there's radiation surrounding everybody from nuclear weapons testing. And so there was a big push to do work on some of the effects of that in the 60s, 70s, even up through the 80s. But a lot of that's kind of gone away. And there was a little bit of a resurgence after Fukushima, but a lot of that's been localized to the areas that have been more impacted.
Another question, can we learn anything from these events about the potential value and design of a rewilding effort? I can imagine you might have unique insights about potential benefits, the size required, the degree of exclusion, etc.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty deep question, and I think a really good question. I think one thing that we can use some of the current tourism in Ukraine for is to really help inform some of that, because we had a situation and we now have some good background information on what populations of these species are and what sort of area these exclusion zones are, how big they are, and what sort of species and the densities of species that have been able to repopulate those areas. And now there are some opportunities to explore how increased human activity, even if it's not consumptive, can alter or not alter some of those population sizes. And so I think especially for some of the carnivores, for example, some of the large carnivores, I think some of the population information we have can be a pretty good indicator of how viable those populations are over the long term. But again, the work that I talked about today is some of the only work on some of these large mammals. And so there's so many questions related to that we would need to tackle that I think are ripe for exploring.
Someone said, you said you're an environmental ecologist, right?
Yeah, well, I'm a wildlife ecologist by training, but I over the last few years, a lot of my interests are in anthropogenic impacts on wildlife. And so I've done a lot of work in agricultural systems to understand how fragmentation in agriculture influence animal populations. On the Savannah River site where I work now, there's a lot of contamination. So we're starting to explore how contamination influences wildlife populations. And so this theme of Chernobyl and Fukushima kind of fits into that, but always coming at it from a very wildlife perspective.
Okay, and I think we have time for one or two more questions, but I just wanted to note we are also doing a lunch and learn tomorrow, and you can register for that on the website at the Friday schedule. You'll see that there's the different rooms for student talks, and right below that there is a pre-registration tab for that. But we have two more questions. we'll answer those. But if you want to talk to Dr. Beasley a little bit more about his expertise and about himself and his research, you're welcome to do that and talk in an informal manner. But these last two questions, so the first one is, do you have any current Chernobyl, Fukushima studies that you're doing, and do you plan on doing more?
Yeah, so in Fukushima, we've got a whole series of studies. We just wrapped up several that we're getting ready to publish, but we have several studies right now that we're working on really related to effects. So looking at effects on the microbial systems within organisms, effects to reproduction. We've got a very large study on reproductive effects, and we're getting ready to start some additional studies on wild boar, and my hope is we can get some studies going on Japanese or Eurasian black bear in Fukushima. In Chernobyl, we're right now publishing several more studies. We just wrapped up some other work, and we're in the process of beginning some new studies, hopefully in the spring. This current situation has thrown a wrench in all of that. We've had to cancel all of our spring planning meetings and everything. So I think that'll get pushed back a year or so, but that's the goal, is to really start expanding on some of the work on the horses in Chernobyl over the next year or two.
And the last question is, have you applied any artificial intelligence into your research?
Yeah, so not yet in these areas, but in a lot of other work that I do, using artificial intelligence and machine learning to analyze camera images. And so many of these studies that we do, we end up with hundreds of thousands or millions of images. I've got a study we're analyzing the data for now where we have like 3 or 4 million images, and it takes an army of people a tremendous amount of time to go through those images. And so we're able to use machine learning algorithms to actually filter out images that don't have animals in them, and also they're sufficient to actually quantify the individuals, or not the individuals, but the species in those photos. So that's I think those sort of methods are going to become a wave of the future in how we analyze these massive data sets, because we're collecting data at a much more fine scale than ever before now.
All right, well, thank you so much, Dr. Beasley. Again, I just want to reiterate, you can talk more with Dr. Beasley and our other plenary speakers if you go to the Lunch and Learn on our virtual website. You need to pre-register for that. You'll receive a link and a password, and you'll be able to talk one-on-one with our plenary speakers. Again, thank you, and we will see you tomorrow.
All right, thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So we will reconvene in 10 minutes. So our next speaker will be Dr. Otso Obuskainen, and we will be back at 11:30.